Hey everyone, welcome back. So today is fertilizing day here in my garden. So today I thought I would go over everything that you need to know about how to fertilize your garden, and I'll show you how I fertilize mine. Let's get into it. Okay, so first things first, what is a fertilizer? Well, fertilizers are a product that you put into your garden that contain nutrients that your plants need to thrive. So plants need a few different nutrients in order to grow and thrive, but most fertilizers focus on the three main nutrients needed by plants, and those include nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, which happen to correspond with the three numbers that you see on most fertilizer packages. So just again, the first number is nitrogen, the second number is phosphorus, and the third number is potassium. So nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are all needed by the plant, but they all help the plant or support the plant in different ways. So for example, nitrogen supports the green parts of your plant. It is a needed nutrient in chlorophyll production. So when you think about nitrogen, think of anything that's green on the plant. So the leaves and the stems, nitrogen helps support these parts of the plant. And I specifically brought you out to my pepper patch because this patch is a little bit low in nitrogen. So I don't know if you can see, but I'll just pick off one of these plants. The bottom leaves of my pepper plants are starting to turn yellow, and this is because the plant is lacking, or the soil I should say, is lacking in nitrogen, which is causing the leaves to yellow because there's not as much chlorophyll being produced. Phosphorus, which is that middle number, helps support the root development of your plants and the flower and fruit production. So if you're having a plant that is really leafy and green and looks really healthy otherwise, but it's not producing any flowers or fruit, it's probably lacking in phosphorus. So give your plant a little dose of a fertilizer that's high in phosphorus, and that should get the flower and fruit production going. So last but not least, we have potassium. So potassium is a key component of photosynthesis, which is of course very important for all of our plants, but it also helps our plants deal with disease and pest pressures and drought and heat stress. Okay, so now that we've discussed how fertilizers help our plants, let's now talk about the types of fertilizers that you can buy in the store. So there are two main groups, I guess you can say, of fertilizers that you can buy in your local big box store or your local garden center, and those are organic fertilizers and synthetic fertilizers. Organic fertilizers are usually made from organic components, including things like compost, manure, blood meal, bone meal, kelp, etc. And one of the key differences between organic and synthetic fertilizers is that organic fertilizers feed the soil and not necessarily the plant directly. And I'll talk about the pros and cons of this in a second. Whereas synthetic fertilizers are usually made in a factory or in a lab, and they are, I guess, more pure forms of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and these components or this product usually feeds the plants themselves and not the soil. And like I just mentioned, there are pros and cons to both. So for example, organic fertilizers, because they feed the soil, over time you're actually improving your soil health, which is of course really important for a really healthy garden. But because they are feeding your soil and are relying on the microbes in your soil to break down the fertilizer, it takes some time for that fertilizer and those nutrients to be accessible by your plants. So when you're feeding with an organic fertilizer, it might take some time for your plants to be able to absorb all of those nutrients. With synthetic fertilizers, because they are made to be accessible to your plants right away, they are able to give a dose of nutrients to your plants. So if you have plants that are looking very sickly, synthetic fertilizers usually work best because they are available to your plants almost instantly. But because they are in higher concentrations, you do run the risk of actually adding too much fertilizer to your plants and causing the roots to burn, which can cause some issues for your plants. Also, because synthetic fertilizers are such high doses of these nutrients, if you add too much to your soil, what ends up happening is that when it rains, a lot of that nutrient runs off and goes into the environment and can cause some harm in places that aren't even in your garden. So I guess just to briefly summarize, organic fertilizers feed your soil versus synthetic fertilizers that feed your plant. Organic fertilizers might take some more time to become accessible to your plants, but they do improve your soil health over time. whereas synthetic fertilizers will be available to your plants almost instantaneously, but you do run the risk of burning your plants if you add too much into your soil, and of course, you run the risk of adding too much nutrients to the environment, which can cause some other types of issues. And while we're speaking of higher concentration of fertilizers, I should have mentioned earlier that these three numbers, which are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, the numbers themselves represent the percentage of those nutrients within your fertilizer. So for example, this fertilizer contains 3% nitrogen, 1% phosphorus, and 4% potassium. And so you'll see that a lot of organic fertilizers tend to have lower concentrations of these nutrients when compared to synthetic fertilizers. So that's just something I thought I would mention as well. So I guess just one more thing to add, you can buy fertilizers in liquid versus granular form, and these both also have their pros and cons. So liquid forms tend to be more easily available to your plant than granular forms, but granular forms slowly release those nutrients into the soil. So they release slowly over time, so you don't need to fertilize as often because they're slowly being worked in and broken down into the soil. So if you have some plants that are looking a little stressed in some way, or that they're going through some type of nutrient deficiency, a liquid fertilizer might be able to provide those nutrients to your plants a little bit quicker than the granular form, but the granular form will work over an entire summer, for example, so you don't have to fertilize as often. So those are some pros and cons to consider as well. I personally use both in my garden. I use a liquid fertilizer every week, and then I use a granular form every 2 weeks, I would say. But I guess this is another important point, is to make sure that you are fertilizing using the directions on the containers of fertilizer that you're using, because you do not want to risk burning your plants or providing too much nutrients, because that can also cause issues for your plants. So definitely read the directions on all of your fertilizer packages. So applying liquid fertilizer is pretty simple. All you have to do is mix up your fertilizer in a watering can according to the fertilizer packages. And then all you do is just provide a little dose to each of your plants. So one mistake I often see with granular fertilizer is that folks will just sprinkle it on top of their soil like this. And yes, of course, it will eventually break down, but if you really want it to work for you, what I recommend doing is creating like a valley on either side of your plants, and then sprinkling some of the fertilizer in, and then working it in to like the top inch of soil. This is important because, like I had mentioned earlier, organic fertilizers, which is what I'm using, they are broken down by soil microbes. And if those soil microbes can't access the fertilizer, they can't break it down. So it'll just take way longer if you keep it on the surface, whereas if you work it into that first inch of soil, it will really have a chance to break down and be accessible to your plants. So here's just a closer shot of what I mean. So I have 2 peanuts here, for example. So I'll put like a little valley in the middle there, and then take my fertilizer and sprinkle it in, and then just kind of close that up and work it into the soil. And then it's also really important to water in granular fertilizer, because you want to start that breakdown process as soon as possible. If you are new to fertilizing your garden, I highly recommend just getting one fertilizer that's well balanced, so it'll have the same number across the board for your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Something like a 10-10-10 works great because it provides nutrients that your plants will all need in a well-balanced form, instead of having to try to go out and buy some fertilizers that are higher in nitrogen or some that are higher in phosphorus, etc. It just makes it a lot simpler in figuring out how to fertilize your garden. And that's a wrap for this video. If you enjoyed it, please make sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. I hope you have a wonderful week in the garden.